Work session for November 20th, 2018 at approximately 5:33 p.m. on a Tuesday. I call this meeting order. Roll call. Hello.
We'll be with you in just a moment, Mayor.
Sure. Now we know why we're late.
I don't have any elevator music to play.
So when she walks in, everybody look at her.
Clap, we'll all clap for her.
Yeah,
when she
everybody
walks out.
clap. Yeah, that's a good one.
Clap.
What, the free screen? Jim, I like that tie, man. I like that tie.
What happened?
Jim's tie.
Thank you very much. It's been a long day.
It has.
I've been wearing a tie all day.
Yeah.
Not my favorite thing to do, but.
What do we got here?
Can I move for all things to be filed into, so you receive the fire department message?
I literally did not notice that she wasn't sitting right next to me. Like that's
I have
a
to be
bad
honest, I
omen.
didn't either.
It's a bad omen.
When do we receive the file? I'm just gonna go all together, fire department message.
So everyone ready for Thanksgiving? It's here.
I tell people they usually ask, haven't missed one yet. Like when people say for Christmas, oh my God, I'm not ready.
That's a good answer.
Somehow you finally get it done.
That's a good answer.
They just said, CDC just said, throw out all your romaine lettuce, E. coli.
Oh, I know what that's about.
It'd be very cold, yeah.
I eat a lot of romaine lettuce.
That's the one, yeah.
I'm not a big iceberg fan, so. Guess I have to do that green mix stuff.
Guess they're trying to get it.
That's just reading it.
I could have done the roll call and we could have done the salute to flag. I don't want to deal with the repercussions. You know, she's got it right down, and you stick with the expert.
Is she upstairs?
Again,
Hey, Jim. Get the mic. Oh, okay. Bruce.
Hello? Can you hear me back there?
Can you hear me?
Everybody hear? Everybody cool?
Yep.
How's that? Got some technical difficulties in the back.
Actually, it wasn't really me.
Oh, no, you gotta sit over there. That's my fault.
Jeannie,
No problem.
she can't hear us. She can't hear us.
You can't hear us in the back?
No, she can hear the tap, but she can't hear the voices. Peggy, can you hear us? What'd she say, yes? Yes?
thumbs up, Mayor.
Do jumping jacks. Okay.
Okay, we good?
All right, we'll do this another round.
Absolutely.
Practice. Welcome to the City of Millville work session for November 20th, 2018 at approximately 5:37. I call this meeting to order. Roll call, please.
Mayor Santiago.
Here.
Commissioner Pipitone.
Here.
Vice Mayor Parent.
Here.
Commissioner Udalvis. Here. Commissioner Cooper.
Here.
Can we all stand, salute the flag, please? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And can we have a moment of silence for those who are suffering and loss of life in California? Thank you. You may be seated. Madam Clerk, are there any review changes to the agenda?
No, Mayor.
Public comment on agenda items only. Anyone that
anyone who has a comment on an agenda item, please step up to the mic, state your name and your concerns, and limit your comments to 5 minutes, please. See no one, I close the public comments on agenda items only. Presentation.
Marcy.
Okay, we have
Marcy.
Oop.
Oh, sorry.
okay.
We're going to call Marcy.
Oh, sure.
Vice Mayor, go ahead.
Yeah, Marcy? Marcy has a quick report she'd just like to submit and talk about very shortly. Thanks, Marcy.
Earlier today, I sent you all a copy of my best practice checklist that was sent up to the state on the 13th. There were 61 questions, and we answered positive to 54. So our score was 98%, which that means we don't get any reduction in our state aid.
Nice.
But at some point, we really do need to address the questions that we answered no to.
There was only 3, right, Marcy? Or there was more than 3?
No, there were 7.
Okay, I saw 3 then.
Right.
They were all in red?
Not necessarily. The red were the ones that were critical, that you had to have a yes. Some are
Okay.
weighted more than
They're the
some
ones
of the
that I
others.
looked at. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think any of them were things that we can't do. So I think
Right.
if we all work together, we could probably answer all of them yes
Correct.
at some point.
Great.
Thank
Thank
you,
you
Marcy.
for that report. That was positive.
Excellent.
Anything else,
Thanks.
Vice Mayor?
No, thanks, Mayor.
You're welcome. Thank you, Marcy. All right, we'll now go to the presentation of Rio Tinto. Solicitor, what do we call first? Do we call their attorney, or? I don't have any names.
Fraser Thompson, Mr. Mayor,
Okay.
from Rio Tinto, and he's been working, the city knows, for a long time on environmental cleanup of the Wheaton property. Things were delayed by the court case where there was a question as to our ownership of the property as opposed to GGI, but now that that case has been settled with the city reaffirming their right of ownership, we can get back to work on the progress of getting this site cleaned up, and that is the presentation that you'll now receive.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's all
Just-
yours.
Thank you very much. Just in terms of time frame, you guys have 45, an hour, 2.5 hours. It's 15 minutes, okay?
That's
if I can
fine.
try and keep it to.
We'll let you know.
Thank you very much. I guess first of all, thank you for making the time in your agenda. I do appreciate it. And to start, I guess I'd like to say thank you for the ongoing support that the city's provided. It's been very appreciated from our perspective, particularly with the Public Works Department, and Brian Provich and the engineering team has been very cooperative in terms of helping us get the work completed on the project. So we really have been appreciative of the city's support and ongoing support in terms of moving the project forward. This is the first time I think I've addressed the commissioners as a whole. Mayor, I know that we've met in the past on this. Maybe just 2 seconds. We are the former owners of the Wheaton Industries property, and I know the city had now is again the owner, I guess, of the property itself. But Rio Tinto is a mining company now, but through predecessor companies, we actually own Wheaton Industries and the Wheaton packaging facilities, several of them in the area, and notably the parcel that the city owns currently. When we sold that under ISRA, under the New Jersey State ISRA regulations, there's an obligation to go back and investigate any impacts that you might have from your prior operations on the property and take steps to bring them into compliance for industrial and commercial properties. So my role in our organization is to monitor and to manage those projects. And we've been involved on this property performing environmental work on it since well back before the 2000s, so back into the early 90s. And even prior to that, there was cleanup that was performed even as part of the Wheaton companies. So there's a long history in that I won't be getting into as a part of this, but the work that we're doing now is hopefully getting to the very end of those steps of what has been progressive cleanup on the property as the use of the property has changed, starting in the 80s with pulling underground storage tanks, as those were, many of you will be familiar from other sites. The state, generally the U.S. got rid of underground storage. Those were pulled and cleanups were performed. And then progressively we've investigated the entire property and identified areas that still have some concerns on them. So what I wanted to do tonight was just give a very quick update as to what we've accomplished over the last couple of years since we've been actively working here at the property, and talk a little bit about what's to come. And I have a few lovely slides, not too many, I promise. I'm not deaf by PowerPoint. But just for those who haven't maybe looked at it in quite a while, I'm going to speak specifically to 300 G Street, which is the city-owned parcel. It's one subsection of what was the former Wheaton glass plant. It includes also historically it included also 1300 Wheaton, which is, I don't think I should be adding the curse there. Also includes buildings to the north and a little bit to the east on this diagram. The southern operations constitute about 48 acres, and they actually stopped production back in about 2005, I believe, on the southern property. So that this parcel hasn't been actively producing glass for the better part of a decade and more. The site itself, for those of you who, I'm sure many of you would know better than I, but we're talking, started in the 1880s. This is a great picture from your Library of Congress of some of the boys who used to work. It's right in front of the south plant on the city-owned piece of property. And everyone apparently, except for this little guy on the very end, was one of the workers in the facility. And it employed a lot of young people as well as the artists that were working on the glass in the facility. So they ran from pretty much continuously from the 1880s all the way through to the 2000s as a glass facility, and really took its current form between 1980 and 1990 when it had its current layout. I mentioned earlier our engagement with the property is largely related to ISRA, the Industrial Site Remediation Act. That required us to go on and do a comprehensive investigation on the property, and it identified three main things. Some contamination in the I guess I should say, we're performing the investigation and the cleanup in compliance with ISRA. We also have what's called a licensed site remediation professional, which is a horrible mouthful, but LSRP, who monitors our compliance against that. So we actually have someone who's consistently monitoring the work that we do and making sure that it meets the state's expectations. And that individual is licensed by the state to provide that service. What we found on the site essentially is three things. There were impacts in sediments, and on the 300 G Street, that was Ada Pond. We found some small impacts in soils, really not a lot. Very typical. There was a former foundry on the property that we did some small targeted removals for, some other metals, and there were some PCBs around transformers, which is pretty typical of historical operations. And there were and still are today some issues in groundwater, and that's the part I'm going to talk primarily about this evening. The sediments themselves, we did an extensive project, and I'll show you a couple of pictures of that, to do remediation over the last year and a half. The soils, we did targeted remediation and removals this year, and both of those we believe are complete and should be signed off by the state very shortly. So impacts that have been there for many, many years, were not mobile, weren't going anywhere, but had been present on the property, have now been cleaned up in both sediment and soils. And we did an extensive amount of work on those. And as I said, I'm going to talk about the groundwater, where we still have two things. We have some leftover impacts from some of the fuel storage that was on the property. So that's, when we say hydrocarbons, the constituents are some breakdown products from those, but really we had leaks from some tanks. And so we have a couple locations that have that. And then we also have some impacts from chlorinated solvents. So those were metal cleaning primarily. They were used to clean the molds in the glass plant. And some of that from storage areas and elsewhere has gotten into the soil and then into the groundwater. And so we have a little bit of that that's left on the property, and that's primarily what's left to address at this point. This is a lovely picture of some of the work that we did this past winter. So you can see this is actually on Ada Pond, which is the pond in the middle of the facility. You can see we have an excavator that we actually floated out on a barge, and it was removing the material into another barge, transporting it off. We sent it off to a licensed disposal facility and stabilized it and then shipped it. And we took about 13,000 tons, so essentially 5 feet almost across 3 acres out of the bottom of the pond last year. We'd done a similar cleanup in the north, in ponds 1, 2, and 3, which is up near where Shepherd Bus is, for those of you who know that property, just north of the glass plant, a couple of years prior. And there we took out another about 8,000 tons out and put it into licensed disposal. In the case of the pond, we also put down kind of a clean sand layer just as a marker to show where we had done the cleanup to, so we have a clean line there going forward. And that was very successful, I think. Yeah, please.
What will happen to those ponds?
So the ponds themselves, it's actually an industrial pond. It's not a state open water. I think a future user could use it as is. Right now it receives stormwater from the entire site. So a future user could continue to use it that way or could modify it. It really wasn't, it was originally a borrow area. They actually took the sand out of it from about 1940 to 50 and used it in the glass plant.
Oh, wow.
And then when they got to the water table, they stopped digging, and then they had this giant hole in the middle of the facility. I think they just said, that's enough, we can't dig any further. But the records on that are a little, I don't have a, that's a bit lost in the sands of time, frankly. Yeah, it's not considered state open water. It's really just an industrial pond. So it could be, someone could eventually backfill it or do whatever they had to with it.
Gotcha.
This is not a great diagram. I'm going to blow it up in a little bit. What you see here essentially are the locations of the plumes on the property. So it's hard to see, but can you see my cursor? Right, this is the corner right here of, and I'll get the highway number wrong, but BBT Bank is here on the corner. This is the very southwest end of the property. There's a former fuel storage in that area. That's where we have benzene and 2-methylnaphthalene. The larger area right in the middle of the southern property here is the solvent plume. So trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene, PCE, you might know as dry cleaning fluid, actually, is what it's most commonly used at, as they were used as cleaners for metals in this case. So we have both of those present, not at significant levels, but still present above the state limits in groundwater. The plumes are stable. They're delineated, so they're not growing. This stuff isn't moving anywhere. We've been watching it for many years, and the levels essentially have stayed more or less the same, and the plumes haven't been moving. They're not mobile on the property. They show pretty much a stable trend at this point. They certainly have reduced over time, but it's not going quite as quickly as we would like at this point. There's also a number of naturally occurring metals. The sands have metals in them, and there's some naturally occurring metals in the groundwater as well.
Did you say that it's dissipating over time, the chemicals?
They do. So the fuels break down naturally in the aquifer. The solvents, unfortunately, were designed to be very, very stable. They don't break down. They don't break down with heat. There are bugs that eat them, but it can be very slow depending on what the specifics of your site are. So I'm coming to how we would like to address that.
Okay.
Obviously, this is not a drinking water source. It's not affecting residents. It's contained on site, generally with the exception of one small area there in the south where it's actually mingled with some other off-site impacts from other fuel storage locations. But it's not a public health hazard, and it is. I mean, the state is aware of all of this. It's in the investigation reports that we provided. So I have some blow-ups here. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but you can see this is the footprint of benzene in the southeast corner. This is 2-methylnaphthalene. Both of those are constituents from the fuel, and you can see we're right down in the southwest corner of the property here. This is perchloroethylene, so this is the dry cleaner fluid in groundwater above the state limit. Again, please don't think that this is a massive free product. This is just a portion of it that's been detected in groundwater that's above the state limit for this item. And this is the TC. And you see the darker numbers. This is where the original storage was on the property, which is an elevated pad where they had some drums. And you can see they used it in both of these buildings. So some of it clearly got out and needs to be addressed. We have some options here, or the state provides options for dealing with this kind of contamination. This is not unusual for sites, and again, I think the levels that we're dealing with here are not such that it's. I hesitate to give too much color to it, but in my view, and based on lots of other sites we've seen, this is not a really highly contaminated site. It's something that is above the limit, so it needs to be addressed, but it's not something that needs us to go in and excavate all of the soils out. It really is something that we think we can use some fairly traditional and pretty straightforward treatment methods. So we looked at 4 different ways of treating this. They all come with different costs and different time frames. Monitored natural attenuation essentially means monitoring it to make sure it doesn't go anywhere and waiting for natural processes to break it down. The issue there is that it could take between 20 and 50 years to fully break down the impacts that we have on the property. We looked at in situ bioremediation, which means introducing bugs and other amendments into the groundwater to get them to clean up the contaminants. And that we're looking somewhere in the order of 10 years to do that. Pump and treat means literally what it sounds like, pumping the water out and treating it. And then a fancier version of that, for lack of a better term, they call it DGR, dynamic groundwater recirculation, is essentially pumping the water out at one end, but putting it back in up gradient so that we end up flushing it quicker. And it really, as you can see, it takes us from 5 to 15 years down to 2 to 5 years. And I think really we're hoping that between 2 to 3, if we're able to put this in place, that would be one alternative. We are strongly advocating for the last of those. One of our objectives on all of our properties that have these kind of historical impacts is to try and get ourselves to a point where we can say that it's clean and the state agrees that it's ready. It can be reused today, but we have this ongoing obligation, and we'd like to put in place a system to clean it up as quickly as possible. What does that mean? It means we need to put wells in. We need to put a treatment system in place to deal with that, and we'd like to do it. You'll note that there are plumes that are on the northern property as well. We'd like to do it for both properties at the same time. There's a bunch of detail I won't get into on here, but essentially what we're going to do is install that system. So install some additional wells that let us pull water out at one end and put clean water back in, so we're flushing out the contamination. The impacted water would be cleaned and discharged, and we would essentially be recirculating the water. It has a lot of advantages. It lets us work under the buildings without moving them. It lets us get that system working quicker and hopefully drop those levels down as quickly as is feasible. We're talking about a system that fits into kind of a 30 by 50 area. It's not huge. And we'd be putting these, they'd look like a box, like a catch basin box, but it's a vault that goes into the ground. You have essentially a 2 foot by 2 foot hole, 2 feet deep, and the well gets installed in it, which means you can drive over it, you can walk over them. It's pretty innocuous, with piping that runs in between them. And the system would be centralized for both properties. And it's hard to see on this, I apologize. The black is a little hard, but this red box here is where we're proposing to put the treatment system for both properties. This is the very south edge of Ada Pond, for those of you who've been on the property. And this is the extension of, I always get it wrong, is it 3rd Street that runs up the middle of the property? The old 3rd Street that runs through the middle, I believe. And so these black lines come down, and you might recall the benzene and the former fuel depots down here in this corner, and the other wells are intended to address that the solvent plume. And so this is our current proposed plan. What we would like to achieve at the property is to put this in place to deal with the groundwater contamination that remains. I think what we would like to ask of the city is, and obviously I'd take any questions you might have about it. I realize I dumped a lot of information, first of all. No one's asleep quite yet. Anything?
You're going to continue, right?
I'm going to. What I think we need from what we'd like to ask of the city is a couple things. One of them is obviously we understand that the city's in a sale process. This system is going to need to be in place for at least 2 to 3 years. We'd like to get started as soon as possible. I think it has some advantages in improving the status of the property. And what we'd like to do is to try to broker an agreement with the city as well as with the potential purchaser to be able to install this now and get started on the next stage in the cleanup of the property. So we'd like to ask the commissioners to support us reaching agreement with all parties to go ahead with this proposal on the city-owned property.
I have a question.
Please.
So we do all this, and you guys walk away, and we have a new owner. What if something comes back? What if something develops that, I'm not saying you overlook, but it just, like you said, some of that solvent, and it just came back. The bugs aren't eating it. Where does the city or the new owners fall?
So when the system runs and we stop it, it's not like we stop. There will be monitoring required afterwards, first of all. And normally you would see, we call it rebound. Sometimes you put in treatment, it one of the nice things about this is it has less percentage, a lower chance of that occurring, but it's a possibility. So there's a requirement from the state that we continue to monitor after we turn off the system. The other thing in our plan is that we intend to shut off, certain parts are less contaminated than others. We'll shut off those sectors and watch them. If we need to turn the system back on, we'll turn it back on and run it for longer. But there is a tail of monitoring that's required afterwards to make sure that the remedy was effective.
So at the cost of the new owner, or at the cost of you guys?
No,
Or
it's
the cost of
on
city?
our cost to make sure that, and part of that oversight that the state has is not that you make a best effort and then leave it.
Right.
It has to be cleaned up to the standard in order for the state to sign off on it. There is some, I'll be frank with you, there's some risk that we don't meet the absolute state standard, that we get the levels down, but they aren't at zero. Because the state standards are very stringent. It's 1. I mean, we're at something like 70, and we need to get to 1. There's a potential that we get to 5 or 10, and then we watch it decline from there because we've removed most of the mass. That would, for me, would be success. I would really like us to get to 0, but that, we may be slightly more complex than that. We have a knowledge of it, but they're natural systems, right? We're dealing with underground contamination.
So your last plan was 2 to 5 years. That's what you recommend. That's what you like to do. What if it goes to 6, 7, 8, continue on?
I think we will run the pump and treat. We'll run the groundwater recirculation program for 2 to 3 years, and at that point, if it hasn't had the success, then it probably isn't going to, and we would reevaluate. I know that it will deal with some areas very quickly, and others that it will certainly reduce the footprint to something that's minimal, and then we'll reevaluate what we need to do for those smaller areas. Would be probably the most logical plan there. It's not. There are no guarantees in this business, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
I wish there were. Yes,
Who
Commissioner.
covered the cost to the prior dredging?
My company, because
In other words, you owned the property and you took care of all that first.
because it was related to our historic operations, we paid for all of the prior dredging work.
Okay.
They purchased Wheaton and the liabilities.
Right.
And essentially, we bought the history because we bought the entire entity.
And,
We s-
and who covers the cost of this? The city now?
No, this is also my organization.
Oh.
Because it's related to our prior operations, we are responsible and we will pay for the entirety of the system.
They're responsible for it all.
All of a sudden, I'm happy.
I was going to ask that because I didn't want our CFO in the corner to swoon. I could already see that she was, that she was there. So just so we're clear.
I think it bears mention, we've spent upwards of $6 million on the pond cleanup. I mean, it was not unsubstantial, and the organization I work for believes that there's an objective here to clean these so that they, and Mayor, to your point, clean them so they don't come back. We want to do this once and do it right, and it hopefully the plan we have is going to be effective in addressing that. But even if it isn't, we will be here and we'll continue to monitor to make sure that it remains safe.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, I wanted to make sure that we punched that point home, that when your company purchased Wheaton, they purchased all the liabilities, they purchased the history, they purchased the responsibility for the cleanup, and this cleanup, that there's no cost to the taxpayer to go out there and do this. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct.
This
sir.
was an agreement that was established years ago, if I'm not mistaken.
So when we
Yeah,
sold
when-
the
yeah.
when we sold it the site when we sold it in 2002, it triggered the ISRA obligation
Yeah.
because we were selling the entity,
Yeah.
and at that point, there have been investigations prior to that, but that started this process in earnest.
I was still here.
Yeah,
You're still here.
you're still here.
Well, I took a little leave, but
Yeah.
I remember it was early part of
No,
that time. when,
absolutely.
you came in and knowing that this was going to be a long process. It wasn't going to be a quick fix. So here we are,
And I think we've made some substantial progress. If you
Yes.
look at what we started with, we used to have contamination in 3 different, in soil and sediment and in groundwater. We're down to just 1. And I think we've made some really good strides in terms of what we wanted to achieve. This is the next step. I think it's the sooner, and I guess the other thing I would say is the sooner we get started, the sooner we're going to be done. I understand we've been involved in, the city's been involved in the process with the bankruptcy court. We would love to have started this a year ago. We've had the plans. I'm pleased to be here now. We've had the plans waiting for a while. I've been buttonholing the mayor whenever I see him at public to talk about it. But we're eager to get going because I think the sooner we get going, the sooner we're going to be able to complete and get it to a point where we're
Fraser, the
less
first
active.
one was with the sale process that you want to start now and that you want to work out an agreement with the city and the contract purchaser. I know there were a couple other things that you were looking for.
So the other items, and we do have an environmental agreement, an access agreement with the city that we put in place when the city took ownership of the property. There are 2 deed notices that we would like to put on the property. So that's a vehicle that the state uses for example, while we're cleaning up the groundwater. A deed notice is quite traditional, or where there are impacts. So we've cleaned to industrial commercial standards the soils, but there will be some impacts that remain on the property that are below industrial commercial standards but above residential. So those are not, they don't require a cap. They're not. There are still some hits in the soil for contamination, again, above a residential level. This is an industrial property. That's not uncommon. However, the state requires us to put a notice on the deed that states to future purchasers that there are impacts above that residential level present here. It's very, very common. It's a tool that the state allows, and we would like to present that deed notice to the city to register on the deed for this property.
And let me say, it's a notice. So what it does, it says anybody that purchases property from the city or anywhere down the title chain says, look, there were environmental issues here. You should do your due diligence. You should look and see what was done and all that. And something that protects, certainly, Rio Tinto protects us as a city, as a seller. So nobody can come back and say, I know it's hard to imagine and believe that anyone in the history of Millville in 100 years wouldn't still know the Wheaton history, but from a legal perspective, it's an important thing.
That was one. The other is one that we had tabled a while ago and had been put on hold, which was there is also a potential, because of the levels in groundwater, there's a potential that there could be what they call vapor intrusion in some areas on the property around where that solvent contamination is. What that means is that the contaminant actually comes up to the soil, to the dry soil, out of the water table, and actually, the word is volatilize. It essentially off-gases into the soil like a radon problem you would have in a residential home, and has a potential to come through the concrete floor into a building. That's what they call vapor intrusion. There's a standard after which you have that risk. It exists on the south side of the property at the moment. One of the things we're hoping to remedy with the groundwater cleanup system is to lower the levels to a point where that's not a risk anymore. But today it is a risk. And as a result, the other deed notice that we tabled to the city was a notice that simply said, this area has the potential for vapor intrusion, and that any purchaser should be aware of that. We hope that that's temporary, and once we get the groundwater levels down, the contamination levels in groundwater down far enough, that we'll be able that won't be necessary anymore, that we could essentially remove that deed notice. But I think as a temporary measure to inform anyone who's coming onto the property, we felt that that was an appropriate, and it's a state kind of authorized vehicle to inform purchasers that that risk exists. So those are the 2 other items that I think we would be looking to the city to support in terms of the property.
Was that the manhole issue going down into the manholes? Remember? I don't know.
It can, I mean, it could,
That
if
would be
someone went down into a manhole.
Yeah.
That would be a similar example. So that's a confined space,
Okay.
but gases accumulate inside a confined space as well. So you have a worker going into one. Typically, you have to test the air in it. It's a similar process, but not the same issue. This is
Okay.
actually more oriented towards work inside buildings. Like inside if you had an enclosed building, even a home, over top of this kind of contaminant, there's that potential.
Okay.
The levels have to be fairly high for it to become a problem in the indoor air, and that's something that we would be testing if the buildings come back into use, because the risk exists. But it's not.
Are those buildings identified already by your company? Are they labeled or?
Currently, none of the buildings in the south are occupied.
Okay.
And as they're all, I mean, you can see the great white stripe in the one here. The roof is collapsed on this building here. So
Right.
there's no sampling at the moment for that because the buildings aren't usable.
It's not a confined space.
It's not,
How about the buildings that come off the main gate there off of 3rd Street?
again, none of them are in use, and most of them don't have doors. So there's so much airflow through them, you would never ever have a problem. When they seal the buildings in and start to use them again, then we will look again and see which buildings need a review for that potential risk. This would just be, the deed notice would simply inform someone who was going to rehabilitate those buildings that the risk exists.
Okay.
And nothing beyond that. And again, I would hope that would be a temporary measure until we get the levels down low enough that we can remove that.
Very good.
So, another thing that I just want to clarify, you talked about the LSRP, the Licensed Site Remediation Professional, and I think probably some of the commission is familiar with the old way of doing it, where the state of New Jersey would send an inspector down from Trenton on a regular basis to go ahead and just check on things and do that, and it would all go up to Trenton. It's correct now, the way the state runs it is they assign this licensed site remediation professional, and that's the person that you're working with and is answering back to the state. And that person doesn't leave when it's a certain number or whatever. There's a continuing, like you said, a tail of monitoring after you've hit your marks, and that you've required or that you've suggested is the fastest cleanup. I believe it's also most expensive. Am I correct? Among the four?
No.
Depending on where it is. It's not the most
It's in the middle.
It's in the middle. Okay, good. That's fine.
I mean, staying out here for 50 years
the
to monitor
word
could
would be
also
aggressive.
cost-
I think it's the most aggressive one.
It certainly is, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you get a year or two into this or 3 years into this and the licensed site remediation professional isn't satisfied with where it's going, they're going to make other recommendations, correct?
Yeah, that is a potential. So the way that the state statute is set up,
Yeah.
you actually hire this individual. We
Right.
pay
They're
them
licensed by the state.
they're licensed by the state. They have individual liability, so it's personal liability on them to ensure that the state rules are enforced. It's a bit of a different model than a lot of other regulatory regimes. It's you effectively pay your own regulator, but they're licensed and they have personal liability. So they're watching what you do and ensuring that it meets the state's requirements. If the system isn't working, I think the way it would work is we would propose an alternate to them, but it would be under their authority that we'd be making that change, and they are tasked with making sure that it meets the state requirements.
So I'll double back. I guess the two things I want to clarify are, number one, the state is heavily involved in this process and monitoring what you're doing, and number two, there's no cost to the taxpayer.
Both of those are correct, and they are absolutely watching to make sure that we meet the remedial objective, and those are very clear. One of the other changes that happened when they introduced the LSRP program was that they clarified what all those targets were, and they're quite rigid. I would say that New Jersey is probably amongst the most strict areas in terms of what industrial cleanup looks like. And I work in many different states and countries, and I can assure you the levels here are as stringent or more than any other regulatory regime that I work in. And
Any other
yes,
questions?
Counselor, just to answer your other question, clearly there is no cost to the taxpayer for the work that we're doing. It's on our own ticket.
Can anybody figure out where Fraser's from? Come on.
Canada?
I forgot the accent.
Commissioner Pepitone?
No. I'll tell you. I met this young man at the gym.
Absolutely,
We were
yes.
working out. Canadian.
Canadian, yeah,
Hey.
that's what it is.
Commissioner Pepitone also guessed it. I didn't say
Ah,
A, though,
okay.
did I? Was there another out and about?
Hey, that's it. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I understand this.
Yes, please.
The LSRP is working pretty much under ISRA.
That's correct.
Are there any other guidelines that they look at as they go through the operation, other than ISRA?
This facility is governed by ISRA, so no, it's only operating under the state statutes. So there aren't federal statutes unless there's something like a PCB cleanup that needs to happen. So we did a very small cleanup of some PCB oil, so we had to work with the EPA, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, on that. But the contamination that's here and the groundwater impacts that we have are all governed under ISRA. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Good question.
I have one more question.
Please.
Could you give me the difference between the under potential remedial alternatives? What's the difference between the pump and treat and the dynamic groundwater research?
So pump and treat is pretty traditional. Essentially, you put a line of wells either in and usually so groundwater flows generally in a certain direction in most cases. You would put a line of wells at where the direction the groundwater is flowing, and you'll be pumping that water out. You might put it in the source areas as well. So you're only pulling. The difference between that and the groundwater recirculation is you then also put wells up gradient and kind of around the outside of the plume, and you push clean water in. So you're creating this kind of cycle, like you're creating a head. You're putting pressure at one end of the process, and you're pulling out at the most contaminated part. So you're trying to pull everything back into the middle, really. And so what it does effectively is speeds up the process. And it means that the same way that the contamination went in, because it started from somewhere usually, right? We had a spill somewhere, something happened historically. The same way that the contamination made its way into the aquifer, into the ground, is the same way we're going to pull it back out. So we're going to pump, and it's going to go through the fastest sands first, and it's going to start to pull from those other little bits that we had a harder time getting at when we were just using pump and treat. That's the theory, and it's been used at a number of different locations. And it's demonstrated that it works a lot quicker because you're not just pulling, but you're pushing and pulling at the same time, if you wanted an analogy for it.
That pushing and pulling sounds a lot more expensive.
Actually, pump and treat is expensive too.
Okay.
You have, all the same infrastructure needs to be there. You need to have a system to clean it. You need pumps to pull the water out. I think it's like an innovation on it. So, and the fact that you don't have to run it for nearly as long has a net benefit as well. I think it's a really nice twist on it without being multiples more expensive. But you need a lot more wells. You need to run, you need to maintain that and run equipment to it.
And so you're saying that's going to take about 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, and some of it will clean up quicker than others. We have a couple of plumes that are much lower levels than others, and hopefully they'll clean up a lot faster. Some of the other some of the benzene stuff may take a little bit longer, and then particularly the source area where the solvents were may take a little bit longer as well. So it could be that we put in the full system, run it, and then we get to start to shut down sectors of it progressively if we have good success with it. We ran a pilot on the 1300 Wheaton property for this and demonstrated that we can move the water. That was question one. Can we really get the thing to deliver what we want? And it showed that we were able to do it. So we have a pretty high level of confidence. We didn't run it across the whole property. We just focused on, I didn't speak to it a lot, but they're the two plumes that are more in the north of the pond. We ran a test on them for about 8 weeks last year that demonstrated we can move the water. It's all sand down here, and that's great for this kind of treatment program. It's not so great in terms of trying to keep other amendments that you might put in place because the water flows fairly easily through sand. So this is it seems to be a good alternative here.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Mayor, do you mind if I ask a question?
Go up to the mic.
First, I want to thank you and Rio Tinto for meeting your obligation to clean this mess up. You didn't cause it, and we appreciate you being here and cleaning it up. But my question is...
Bill, state your name.
Yeah. Bill Davis, Millville, New Jersey. Thank you. And I know you've made a significant investment at this point. So 2 or 3 years down the road, you get a new bloom here, you get a new bloom there, and it's so much more, $1 million. At what point is Rio Tinto going to say, man, we spent enough money there? Or, can you just walk away? Because is Rio Tinto an American company or a Canadian company?
Global.
I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
No problem at all. Rio Tinto we have operations in the U.S.
Mhm.
We have a huge mine in Utah, amongst other places. We're also operating in Arizona and elsewhere. So we do have a large presence here, and we sell a lot of our product into the U.S. The company itself is actually English-Australian dual listed to make life even more complex.
Gotcha. And my point is, I'm advocating for the taxpayers.
Mhm.
I'm so glad to see here. I want to see that property back up and running like it was in the 70s and 80s. And most of my life, we've been looking bones of it for a long time. But I don't want the taxpayer to be held responsible for somebody else's issues, And if you guys say, man, we spent too much already, we're out of here. And would you say you spent $3 or $4 million on the pond?
We spent more than $5 million on the pond.
Yeah, just on the pond, a 5-acre pond on 48 acres.
So the answer to that is, when we sold the property, we signed a remediation agreement with the state.
Mhm.
We can't walk away from that. It's not, even if I wanted to, I can't erase the legal obligation that we have with the state. So in 2002, Rio Tinto signed that. That's what defines what we need to do here. We're not going to be able to say we've spent enough money. That's not the way it works.
17 years later, or 16 years later, you're still here.
Absolutely.
And I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
I just hope that they, times don't really, Rio Tinto doesn't fall in hard times, and
Right.
we got to pay the bill.
Right.
And I know you're all thinking the same way.
Right.
That's why you're asking great questions you're asking. That was just something I had in my mind, and just, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it.
The agreement that you've had with the state back in 2000, whatever
Two.
it was, this continuation of what's being done.
That's
Yeah.
the work that we're doing is still defined by that agreement, and I guess I shouldn't say that's the only thing that's holding us here. I mean, our values are such. We're interested in continuing to operate in the U.S. We do, and we're citing a huge mine. This is one of our values, is that when we have these kind of obligations, that we complete them. And I think testament to that, we're still here.
I think the thing that it does for your company is that if you walk away from this, you're going to lose other business throughout the country and the world probably. So I think that the state is overseeing this whole project to begin with, and you're not going anywhere.
No.
No.
And that's correct. And so, but over and above that, I think it's a value for our organization that we don't walk away from these problems.
Sure.
This isn't the only site we're working on in New Jersey alone, and there are others, but it's an important value for us to make sure that we complete these and that we meet our legal obligations and make sure that they are
and
closed
what you
out
do is
appropriately.
it's a very successful story for you to use later on.
Oh, absolutely.
That's business.
I think the mayor will attest to the fact that it's been several years that Mr. Thompson's been pursuing him for us to get started, certainly for the last year. He's been pursuing me to say, when is this case with GGI where they made this claim against the property that
Right.
slowed us all down? And now that is completed and clear, certainly they've
Time to
had
move
the
forward.
plan in mothballs and they're ready to go.
I agree. Yes. You have to stand up, though, and go to the mic. Can't do it from the seat.
And state your name.
Good evening. My name is Anthony DeSantis, and I'm speaking on behalf of 200 G Street and the adjoining properties. First of all, I'd like to thank Fraser for coming down from Canada in order to speak to us this evening. Fraser and I have worked very closely together, and I can attest to his hard work. And we've had some issues on the property, but I have to tell you that Fraser was immediately on top of it and resolved them. Like any other business and project, problems do arise, and with a phone call to Fraser, they've been handled. Whether it hasn't been capped properly or whatever the case was, I can attest to the fact that he's done a great job on it. I have a couple of concerns, which are realistic concerns for not only the future property owners, being us, and for the city, that I think everybody's overlooking. And a lot of the focus is on, is this city going to be held liable? Is the work going to be completed? There's no doubt in my mind that they're going to finish the work. What I think everybody's overlooking is the deed notice. A deed notice is an unnecessary measure. Though he says it's required by law, the other option is to clean it up entirely. Now, if I were the mayor of Millville, with all due respect to everybody here, I would want my property in the area entirely cleaned by the company responsible for making it dirty to begin with. I would not want a deed notice that would put everyone on alert or on notice that there is contamination on this property and perhaps scare businesses away. So I feel a better alternative to a deed notice would be to actually do the job and do it right. They cleaned it, remediate it, remove the, there's no reason for a deed notice. It's a convenient and cheap way out. And I can tell you that I would be completely against the deed notice. All right. Regarding the gases in the building, there are other contaminants on there that are a major concern. And proper testing hasn't really taken place, mainly because the environment hasn't allowed it. But one of my main concerns is, and Luke can attest to this, we have our people working on it, and I can attest to it, it's not cheap. But, there are factors that if we were to put up a building, or if we were to repair a building that was there will be contaminants that may or may not come into that building. I'm glad we're aware of it now, and as part of our redevelopment process, our people are aware of it, and we're going to do what we need to do on our end. But in no way, shape, or form should we inherit a burden of, because somebody wants to place a deed notice or find a legal maneuver in order to save some money for their company, where we wind up inheriting this burden, not today, not necessarily as part of a legal cleanup, but in the sense of putting up a building and then not being able to use it, or having a customer come in, a client that wants to actually work in that building and losing that company, or having another type of business coming in and not being able to, or just walking away because of those contaminants in the property. So I just wanted to make the commission aware of this, and I think that we should look at it from a different angle.
Thank you, Anthony.
Mayor, if I could just follow up from, I only use 3 minutes. Louis Magazoo, Mr. DeSantis doesn't really need an attorney, but I represent both Mr. DeSantis and Mr. Pratt. At least he doesn't need one for tonight. I want to just reinforce what Anthony said about working with Mr. Thompson. He's really a consummate professional. We've hired Adams Raymond Hagen, ARH, to be our redevelopment consultants, and he was kind enough to meet with them a couple of weeks ago in my office. We could not go forward until tonight's presentation. We did do a walkthrough of the property so that we are on the same page as to where the wells would be placed and where the lines would be run, and we worked very collegial on that. We would ask respectfully, Mayor and Commissioners, and Mr. Schroeder, who, by the way, has been extraordinarily helpful in this whole process, that the deed notice not be signed off on until we get our redevelopment plan in place, because we just don't know what the impact's going to be. I think we need to work on this together and understand what the significance is. I'm not an engineer, I'm not an environmental expert, but I think, so I would ask, with all due respect, that we make it part of our redevelopment plan, our redevelopment inquiry together. As you know, we have to have hearings, we have to come back to you. So I think, I don't know that you were going to do anything tonight anyway, but our request would be that let's make it part of the process rather than make a determination without the benefit of the process. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
Mary Messick here of Millville. From what I'm hearing, I kind of agree with this gentleman here. My concern would be if this property did become the point where it scared people off because you notified people, which personally I think is a good thing. People should know what's going on without hiding things from people. Transparency is the best policy. But if it does scare people off, what's that mean to the city? And on top of that, what's that going to mean to us taxpayers, especially those that live on fixed incomes?
Now, I want to speak to
Thank
that
you, Mayor.
for a minute. As far as the deed notice, so we understand, there's a couple things that I think are misunderstandings about what a deed notice is. So a deed notice does not mean that the property is not going to be cleaned up completely. The property can be cleaned up completely, and the deed notice can state that this is just a notice that this remediation took place. Here's who did it. Here's where you find the files. So that, to me, it's an assurance to any potential buyer. You know, when my private clients want to buy a commercial piece of property, we do what's first called a phase one, which is we hire somebody to go in and do a full investigation of the history of that property, everything that was done. I may not know that this property that I'm buying, that my client's buying, is a general store now, but in 1940 and 1950, it was a gas station. There were pumps out front, right? So the first thing you do is that. You do your due diligence. Then you find out if there are issues there. You do phase two, which is core borings, water samples, and all kinds of things. So a deed notice is something that's used. It doesn't preclude us from cleaning up the property. It's over and above beyond that to go ahead and say, look, there were issues here. We followed state guidelines to remediate all those issues. And as a potential buyer, you need to be aware that this documentation is there. Mary raised a great point. What does it matter to the taxpayer? What matters to the taxpayer, and what I think a deed notice does after full cleanup, and as part of the process, I agree with Mr. Magazoo, I agree with Mr. DeSantis, is it says to any potential buyer, the city is putting you on notice that this issue happened. So let's say you don't have a deed notice, or let's say something happens and the person doesn't do their due diligence. They might come back and sue the city and say, wait a minute, you never let us know. Now, I know that's hard to believe on the Wheaton property, that anybody who would walk into and look at that Wheaton property now or in the next 20 or 30 years would not have any idea of the fact, hey, something very industrial happened here. But from a legal perspective, it's a way for us to protect ourselves as a city from potential future lawsuit, and that's the purpose of it. But it doesn't have to happen right now. And Mr. Magazoo's right. We can work that out. It also has to make sure that, you know, it isn't cleanup or a deed notice. It's cleanup and then a deed notice. You do both.
I do have a question for our city solicitor.
Yeah.
At this time, considering the phases of the project and the cleanup, does the state outline regulations for when deed notices should be, at that point, advertised to the public to know? Because, of course, we want to stay compliant with what regulations would outline,
Sure.
but we also want to make sure, in no way does it diminish the fact that the cleanup must be seen through to completion, but a matter of the city also assuming that legal responsibility and ensuring that we followed through on that as well.
Well, let's start with, you know, there's the actual physical written notice, right, which is a deed notice. There's also constructive notice. I'm sure Mr. Magazoo will agree. As the contract purchaser, if Mr. DeSantis' party goes ahead and purchases, there is no way that they can say, we had no idea this was going on. They have been intimately involved in it. They're here tonight. They've seen the presentation. We've seen the presentation in their office. As far as, that's why as far as the state and guidelines, I could look and see if there's a specific date. It doesn't make sense to me that there would be a specific date, just that it's done as part of the totality of the package, right? And it is the kind of thing that's done on the tail end of things, right? You know, that the deed notice and those things are done at the end, because how am I going to go ahead and lay a deed notice that says the property is cleaned up before the property is fully cleaned up? So we are maybe getting the, you know, so Fraser's asking for a few things, and I don't know that he's asking for a deed notice tomorrow. But what we're talking about is as the process, you know, goes through and we complete it, get closer to completion, those things would be part of that. Now, that's a decision that's up to the commission that's seated at the time. But, you know, I don't think a deed notice tonight is what we're asking for.
Yeah, I didn't take it that way either.
The next thing really that's coming is the first thing he asked for. And the most important thing tonight is that we need to talk about an agreement between the city, the contractor, and Rio Tinto, that you guys are accepting of the DGR plan. You understand, you know, that it is the shortest timeline. You understand that it does not cost the taxpayer. You understand that, you know, what you've heard tonight, and then that this is something that you are willing to have them proceed do on your property, then also because we're in a relationship and a contract purchase relationship with the folks that are here, then they should be part of that conversation as well. At the end of the day, as much as we're all, would love to see, the kind of progress that Mr. DeSantis and his team comes up with, if that deal falls through, it's still your responsibility or it's still your opportunity to have this property cleaned up and back in production like it should be in some form or fashion, and waiting any longer. The thing that was holding us up wasn't deed notices or any of those kinds of things. It was that the former owner, GGI, went to bankruptcy court and held up our full ownership of the property. And they're not going to he didn't know who to talk to for a year or more. And now he knows we have a clear purchaser, or we have a clear owner, I should say, and they want to get started on the most aggressive way.
That was one of the questions why the city wasn't moving forward back in 2017, 2016. And it was mentioned that it's because it's in litigation. It's in bankruptcy. And some people didn't want to hear that, but that was the problem, why it didn't move forward or faster than we would settle that bankruptcy hearing. And it was time-consuming.
That issue cleared long about the end of August. By the time all the releases were signed, mid to late September, it was clear that the city of Millville, the commissioners representing the city of Millville, own that property, and it's time for you to allow these folks to do what they are legally responsible to do. And there is a chance that in a few years you're going to be sitting here and hearing a report, which I think we should have. Do this. It was fun. We should do it on a more regular basis. But you're going to be hearing a report in a few years that this property is effectively cleaned up, which would be wonderful for the city.
We have Mr. DeSantis really wants to get moving on your business and getting things done, whatever guarantees that are out there. And I'm fully aware that I'm sure that there will be other companies once your company starts up that would be really interested in coming to the city because of the product that you're producing out there is really good. I understand where you're coming from. I think it'd be a very successful business that will also attract more businesses into our community, Millville, without question. And we want to make sure that we don't lose you. We want you here, and I'm only speaking for myself, but I'll do whatever I can to make sure that that project succeeds in the city. That's number one priority. It's been a long, drawn-out affair, and nothing more than make us all happy, whether we're here or someone else is here or the prior commissioners who were here, to see that project work, and we bring business to that piece of property that we all want to see something positive to do. And, I'm sure that's going to be our commitment. I know it's going to be mine to make it happen somehow. So I want you to know that, Anthony. We want you here, okay? And I know your redevelopment plan and all that's very important, but we're going to do all we can.
Mr. Thompson.
I guess I understand, and I'm sensitive to the concerns that have been raised about the deed notice, and I understand it's part of a conversation about what is and isn't appropriate. I just wanted to clarify a couple of points. One of them being, there's no intention to leave contamination on an industrial property, first of all. I heard a couple of comments about that, and the intention isn't to leave contamination there. I mentioned earlier, we are governed by a standard. The intention is that we be entirely compliant with what's required of us. And I think we've invested a lot. I don't need to keep beating that drum, but we're dedicated to making sure we meet that. So it is, however, an industrial property, and the state has certain requirements that are different than a residential, than a school, than a sensitive use. It's an industrial plot of land, and that will continue to be the case. And that means in some cases that it has, as you can understand, there's a different standard for something that's being used for industrial than for other uses. And our obligation is to make sure that it continues to be available to be used that way. And so we have every intention of meeting that. We're not leaving contamination that can affect human health, that can affect workers, that can affect people on the site, but we're working to meet that standard. And it still may mean a discussion about what deed restrictions are required because it's a state obligation, not because the site is sensitive in any way or that future cleanup costs are going to be incurred. But with respect to Mr. DeSantis' group, I understand their hesitancy, and I think that it's something that obviously we're open to continue to discuss. But I do feel it's something, it's probably not going to go away. We need to sort it out. But I understand, I'm quite sensitive to their concerns about it as well.
So, Mayor and Commission, before we moved any further with this, I felt it was important for you to come and hear this presentation so you know what we're talking about. Unless there's vocal opposition to it, I'm not asking for a vote. Unless there's vocal opposition, what I think the next step for us to do, I wanted you to see this first, is that we're going to be bringing an agreement to you between the contract purchaser, the city, and Rio Tinto about how to go ahead and go forward with DGR, and then you'll be voting on that. Now you've been educated, and the public's been educated about what's happening there. I don't have the history that any of you have here. I'm not saying that, but even I've been around here long enough, back in the 90s and now, to have heard all kinds of horrific, weird stories about what was buried out at Wheaton and what was done, and every kind of environmental boogeyman that's out there. You've now heard from a man, who has told you what is out there. He's got the numbers. It's there. It's going to be cleaned up, and that's going to go back into active, business here in this city in a very short period. That's something to celebrate.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for the work that you've done. I mean, it's refreshing to hear all the questions, and it's exciting to see what the future holds. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Anyone
Can
else?
I just have two more questions, really quick, real short. The DGRs, I find it compelling. What other locations have you used this process? You mentioned there are some others that have been successful.
So we engage consultants, we engage experts, and the group that we're using has used it at a number of different locations, both in New Jersey and elsewhere. I don't have a list, unfortunately, but I could certainly provide you with some examples. They've been presented at conferences as a leading technology in dealing with these kinds of plumes. But I don't have a list of those with me.
Is there any local that you would know of offhand?
I'll have a look, Commissioner, and I'll certainly get back to you. Not offhand, no.
Okay.
Anyone else?
No.
And Lou, you had mentioned that there's going to be an environmental plan. Just wanted to hear more, a little bit more about that, if I could.
Yes, Commissioner. As part of the process, and we literally had to wait until this presentation and this understanding, we have engaged ARH, which is an engineering firm well known to the area, to help us with a redevelopment plan. The redevelopment plan then would have to go before your planning board as well as the city commission. A component part, because of this site, is the environmental part. You might not always have that. For example, if I was doing a redevelopment of a shopping center and a housing area, I might not need that. But because of the uniqueness, and part of the reason we engaged ARH is not only are they experiencing redevelopment plans, they're also experiencing the environmental piece. So they'll be looking at this from both angles.
To be like a check and balance.
Yeah, and it really gives, it gives another set of eyes, a fresh perspective, and it's a responsibility we have to do anyway. But and they're well known to folks in South Jersey as being a top-notch operation. Does that answer your question?
Do they fall under ISRA as well?
Not really.
No?
But I'm sure they will comment on the impact of it. That is fully under the responsibility of Rio Tinto, but I am sure that the redevelopment plan will speak to the history and what the cleanup has been and what the status is. So that would be all part of, because of the uniqueness of the parcel.
The contract purchaser is hiring their own environmental specialists to look at the work done by the state designated site professional, by Rio Tinto, and by all the professionals there. So it's another layer as they do their due diligence to make sure that the statements and that everything matches up, the numbers match up to the realities.
But I want to be clear, because we're on a public record, nobody has any question but that both Rio Tinto and the city has been very forthright. We would have hired a redevelopment team anyway, okay? But the environmental piece is just, how do you dovetail that in? How do you deal with not only a legal notice, but the actual history that is well known? And how do you package that? How do you turn a liability into an asset? They're the kinds of things that would come out of the redevelopment plan from ARH.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all I have. Anyone else? Thank you so much, Mr. Johnson, for your presentation.
Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. And be sure to come back once we get it installed and tell you how it's going.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Council, thank you as well for your clarity.
Let's go right into old business. Is there any old business?
No, Mayor.
Discussion of commissioners. Commissioner Cooper?
None at this time, Mayor.
Commissioner Pepitone?
Nothing right now.
Commissioner Dalovas?
I have no report for this work session, Mr. Mayor.
Vice Mayor Parent?
Not at this time, Mr. Mayor.
And I'll move on to new business.
There's no new business, Mayor.
We've now reached the public comment portion of our meeting. Anyone who would like to address this commission, please go to the podium, state your name, and address your concerns. And please limit your comments to approximately 5 minutes. Seeing no one, I close the public comment portion of this meeting. And go right into resolutions, please.
Okay, we have a resolution authorizing a closed session to discuss the following matters: Adari versus City of Millville under litigation, and economic development projects under contract negotiations.
Mr. Mayor, move the adoption of this resolution.
Second the motion.
Any comments? Roll call.
Commissioner Pepitone?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Parent?
Yes.
Commissioner Udalvis?
Yes.
Commissioner Cooper?
Yes.
Mayor Santiago?
Yes.
Okay, motion carries.
We'll be right back. Thank you.
Do I have to abstain for anything, Jeannie, tonight? Because I wasn't here at the last meeting.